Good evening, and thank you for joining me for another Boring Books for Bedtime. I hope tonight's selection provides all the boredom your busy brain needs to quiet down and let you get some sleep. So find a comfortable spot. Adjust your volume. Take a nice deep breath in. Let it out slowly. And off we go. Tonight we're relaxing with a journey back to New York City in the early 1900s, with selections from The Color of a Great City by Theodore Dreiser, with illustrations by C.B. Falls. First published in 1923 by Boney and Liveright, New York. Let's begin. Forward. My only excuse for offering these very brief pictures of the city of New York, as it was between 1900 and 1914 or 15 or thereabout, is that they are of the very substance of the city I knew in my early adventurings in it. Also, and more particularly, they represent in part at least certain phases which at that time most arrested and appealed to me, and which now are fast vanishing, or are no more. I refer more particularly to such studies as the bread line, the pushcart man, the toilers of the tenements, Christmas in the tenements, whence the song and the love affairs of Little Italy. For to begin with, the city as I see it was more varied and arresting, and after its fashion poetic and even idealistic then than it is now. It offered, if I may venture the opinion, greater social and financial contrasts than it does now. The splendor of the purely social Fifth Avenue of the last decade of the last century and the first decade of this, for instance, as opposed to the purely commercial area that now bears that name, the sparklingly personality-dotted Wall Street of 1890 to 1910, as contrasted with the commonplace and almost bread-and-butter world that it is today. The astounding areas of poverty and of beggary even. I refer to the East Side and the Bowery of that period, unrelieved as they were by civic betterment and social service ventures of all kinds, as contrasted with the beschooled and beserviced East Side of today. Who recalls Steve Brody's, McGurk's, Doyers Street, and Chuck Connors? The city is larger. It has, if you will, more amazing architectural features, but has it as vivid and moving social contrasts, as hectic and poignant and disturbing mental and social aspirations as it had then? I cannot see that it has. Rather, as it seems to me, it is duller because less differentiated. There are millions and millions, but what do they do? Tramp aimlessly for the most part, here and there in shoals, to see a ball game, a football game, a parade, a prize fight, a civic betterment, or automobile exhibition, or to dance or dine in a hall that holds 1,000. But of that old zest that seemed to find something secret and thrilling in 1,000 nooks and corners of the old city, its Bowery, its waterfront, its Rialto, its outlying resorts, not a trace. one cannot even persuade the younger generation that never even knew the old city to admit that they feel a tang of living equivalent to what they imagined once was. The truth is that it is not here. It has vanished along with the generation that felt it. The pictures that I offer here, however, are not, I am compelled to admit, of that more distinguished and vibrant crust which my introduction so far would imply. Indeed, they are the very antithesis, I think, of all that glitter and glister that made the social life of that day so superior. Its shadow, if you will, its reverse face. For being very much alone at the time, and having of necessity, as the situation stood, ample hours in which to wander here and there, without, however, sufficient financial means to divert myself in any other way, I was given for the most part to rambling in what to me were the strangest and most peculiar and most interesting areas I could find, as contrasted with those of great wealth, and to speculating at length upon the phases and the forces of life I then found so lavishly spread before me. The splendor of the, to me, new dynamic, new world metropolis, its romance, its enthusiasm, its illusions, its difficulties, the immense crowds everywhere, upon Manhattan Island at least, the beautiful rivers and the bay with its world of shipping that washed its shores. Indeed, I was never weary of walking and contemplating the great streets, not only Fifth Avenue and Broadway, but the meaner ones also, such as the Bowery, Third Avenue, Second Avenue, Elizabeth Street in the lower Italian section, and East Broadway. And at that time even, in 1894, that very different and most radically foreign plexus known as the East Side, already stretched from Chatham Square and even farther south, Brooklyn Bridge, north to 14th Street. For want of bridges and subways, the city was not as yet so far flung, but for that reason more concentrated and almost as congested. Yet before I was 15 years in the city, all of the additional bridges other than Brooklyn Bridge, which was here when I came, and which so completely served to change New York from the thing it was then to what it is now, were already in place. Manhattan, Williamsburg, Queensboro bridges, and the subway had been built, at least in part. But before then, if anything, the great island, as I have said, was even more compact of varied and foreign groups, and one had only to wander casually and not at any great length to come upon the Irish in the lower east and west sides, the Syrians in Washington Street, a great mass of them, the Greeks around 26th, 27th, and 28th Streets on the west side, the Italians around Mulberry Bend, the Bohemians in East 67th Street, and the Sicilians in East 116th Street and thereabouts. The Jews were still chiefly on the east side. Being fascinated by these varying nationalities and their neighborhoods, I was given for the first year or two of my stay here to wandering among them, as well as along and through the various parks, the waterfronts, and the Bowery, and thinking, on this welter of life and the difficulties and the strangeness of it. The veritable tides of people that were forever moving here, so different to the Middle West cities I had known, and the odd or at least different devices and trades by which they made their way. The small shops, trades, tricks even. For one thing, I was often given to wondering how so many people could manage to subsist in New York by grinding hand organs alone, or shining shoes, or selling newspapers or peanuts, or fruits or vegetables from a small stand or cart. And the veritable shoals and worlds even of beggars and bums and idlers and crooks in the Bowery and elsewhere. Indeed, I was more or less dumbfounded by the numerical force of these, and the far cry it was from them to the mansions in Fifth Avenue, the great shops in Sixth Avenue and 23rd Street, the world-famous banking houses and personalities in Wall Street, the comfortable cliff dwellers who occupied the hotels and apartment houses of the Upper West Side and along Broadway. For being young and inexperienced and penniless, these economic differences had more significance for me then than they have since been able to maintain. Yet always and primarily fascinated by the problem of life itself, the riddle of its origin, the difficulties seemingly attending its maintenance everywhere. Such a polyglot city as this was not only an economic problem, but a strange and mysterious picture, and I was never weary of spying out how the other fellow lived and how he made his way. And yet, how many years it was really after I arrived here, quite all of 10, before it ever occurred to me that apart from the novel or short story, these particular scenes and my own cognitions in connection might possess merit as pictures. And so it was that not before 1904, 10 years later really, that I was so much as troubled to sketch a single impression of all that I had seen, and then only at the request of a Sunday editor of a New York newspaper who was short of small local stuff to fill in between his more lurid features. And even at that, not more than 7 or 8 of all that are here assembled were at that time even roughly sketched. The Bowery Mission, the waterfront, the Cradle of Tears, the track walker, the realization of an ideal, the log of a harbor pilot. Later, however, in 1908 and 1909, finding space in a magazine of my own, The Bohemian, as well as one conducted by Senator Watson of Georgia, and bethinking me of all I had seen, and how truly wonderful and colorful it really was, I began to try to do more of them, and at that time wrote at least 7 or 8 more. The Flight of Pigeons, 6 o'clock, The Wonder of Water, The Men in the Storm, and The Men in the Dark. The exact titles of all, apart from these, I have forgotten. Still later, after the opening of the World War, and because I was noting how swiftly and steadily the city was changing, and old landmarks and conditions were being done away with, I thought it worthwhile to bring together not only all the scenes I had previously published or sketched, but to add some others which from time to time I had begun but never finished. Among these at that time were the fire, Hell's Kitchen, a way place of the fallen, the man on the bench. And then, several years ago, having in the meanwhile once more laid aside the material to the advantage of other matters, I decided that it was still worthwhile, and getting them all out and casting aside those I no longer cared for, and rewriting others of which I approved, together with new pictures of old things I had seen, i.e., bums, the Michael J. Powers Association, a vanished summer resort, the pushcart man, the sandwich man, characters, the men in the snow, and the city awakes, I finally evolved the present volume. But throughout all these latest editions, I sought only to recapture the flavor and the color of that older day, nothing more. If they are anything, they are mere representations of the moods that governed me at the time that I had observed this material at first hand, not as I know the city to be now. In certain of these pictures, as will be seen, reference is made to wages, hours, and working and living conditions not now holding, or at least not to the same severe degree. This is especially true of such presentations as the men in the dark, the men in the storm, the men in the snow, 6 o'clock, the bread line, long since abolished, the toilers of the tenements, and Christmas in the tenements. Yet since they were decidedly true of that particular period, I prefer to leave them as originally written. They bear, I believe, the stamp of their hour. Theodore Dreiser. The color of a great city. The city of my dreams. It was silent, the city of my dreams, marble and serene, due perhaps to the fact that in reality I knew nothing of crowds, poverty, the winds and storms of the inadequate that blow like dust along the paths of life. It was an amazing city, so far-flung, so beautiful, so dead. There were tracks of iron stalking through the air, and streets that were as canyons, and stairways that mounted in vast flights to noble plazas, and steps that led down into deep places where were, strangely enough, underworld silences, and there were parks and flowers and rivers. And then, after 20 years, here it stood, as amazing almost as my dream, save that in the waking the flush of life was over it. It possessed the tang of contests and dreams and enthusiasms, delights and terrors and despairs. Through its ways and canyons and open spaces and underground passages were running, seething, sparkling, darkling, a mass of beings such as my dream city never knew. The thing that interested me then as now about New York, as indeed about any great city, but most definitely New York, because it was and is so preponderantly large, was the sharp and at the same time immense contrast it showed between the dull and the shrewd, the strong and the weak, the rich and the poor, the wise and the ignorant. This perhaps was more by reason of numbers and opportunity than anything else, for of course humanity is much the same everywhere, but the number from which to choose was so great here that the strong, or those who ultimately dominated, were so very strong, and the weak so very, very weak, and so very, very many. I once knew a poor, half-demented, and very much shriveled little seamstress who occupied a tiny hall bedroom in a side-street rooming house, cooked her meals on a small alcohol stove set on a bureau, and who had about enough space outside of this to take 3 good steps either way. I would rather live in my hall bedroom in New York than in any 15-room house in the country that I ever saw, she commented once. And her poor little colorless eyes held more of sparkle and snap in them than I ever saw there before or after. She was wont to add to her sewing income by reading fortunes in cards and tea leaves and coffee grounds, telling of love and prosperity to scores as lowly as herself, who would never see either. The color and noise and splendor of the city as a spectacle was sufficient to pay her for all her ills. And have I not felt the glamour of it myself? And do I not still, Broadway at 42nd Street, on those selfsame spring evenings when the city is crowded with an idle, sight-seeing cloud of Westerners, when the doors of all shops are open, the windows of nearly all restaurants wide to the gaze of the idlest passer-by. Here is the great city, and it is lush and dreamy. A May or June moon will be hanging like a burnished silver disk between the high walls aloft. 100, 1,000 electric signs will blink and wink, and the floods of citizens and visitors in summer clothes and with gay hats, the streetcars jouncing their endless carloads on indifferent errands, the taxis and private cars fluttering about like jeweled flies. The very gasoline contributes a distinct perfume. Life bubbles, sparkles, chatters gay, incoherent stuff. Such is Broadway. And then Fifth Avenue, that singing crystal street on a shopping afternoon, winter, summer, spring, or fall. What tells you as sharply of spring when, its windows crowded with delicate effronteries of silks and gay nothings of all description, it greets you in January, February, and March? And how, as early as November again, it sings of Palm Beach and Newport, and the lesser or greater joys of the tropics and the warmer seas. And in September, how the haughty display of furs and rugs in this same avenue, and costumes deluxe for ball and dinner, cry out of snows and blizzards when you are scarcely 10 days back from mountain or seaside. One might think from the picture presented and the residences which line the upper section that all the world was inordinately prosperous and exclusive and happy. And yet, if you but knew the tawdry underbrush of society, the tangle and mat of futile growth between the tall trees of success, the shabby chambers crowded with aspirants and climbers, the immense mansions barren of a single social affair, perfect and silent. I often think of the vast mass of underlings, boys and girls who, with nothing but their youth and their ambitions to commend them, are daily and hourly setting their faces New Yorkward, reconnoitering the city for what it may hold in the shape of wealth or fame, or if not that, position and comfort in the future, and what, if anything, they will reap. Ah, their young eyes drinking in its promise. And then again I think of all the powerful or semi-powerful men and women throughout the world, toiling at one task or another, a store, a mine, a bank, a profession, somewhere outside of New York, whose one ambition is to reach the place where their wealth will permit them to enter and remain in New York, dominant above the mass, luxuriating in what they consider luxury. The illusion of it, the hypnosis deep and moving that it is, how the strong and the weak, the wise and the fools, the greedy of heart and of eye, seek the nepenthe, the lethe of its something hugeness. I always marvel at those who are willing, seemingly, to pay any price, the price, whatever it may be, for one sip of this poison cup. What a stinging, quivering zest they display! How beauty is willing to sell its bloom, virtue its last rag, strength an almost usurious portion of that which it controls, youth its very best years, its hope or dream of fame, fame and power their dignity and presence, age its weary hours, to secure but a minor part of all this, a taste of its vibrating presence and the picture that it makes. Can you not hear them almost singing its praises? The city awakes. Have you ever arisen at dawn or earlier in New York and watched the outpouring in the meaner side streets or avenues? It is a wondrous thing. It seems to have so little to do with the later, showier, brisker life of the day, and yet it has so very much. It is in the main so drab or shabby smart at best, poor copies of what you see done more efficiently later in the day. Typewriter girls in almost stage or society costumes entering shabby offices, boys and men made up to look like actors and millionaires turning into the humblest institutions where they are clerks or managers. These might be called the machinery of the city, after the elevators and streetcars and wagons are excluded, the implements by which things are made to go. Take your place on Williamsburg Bridge some morning, for instance at say 3 or 4 o'clock, and watch the long, the quite unbroken line of Jews trundling push-carts eastward to the great wallabout market over the bridge, a procession out of Assyria or Egypt or Chaldea, you might suppose, biblical in quality, or better yet, a huge chorus in some operatic dawn scene, laid in Paris or Petrograd or here. A vast silent mass it is, marching to the music of necessity. They are so grimy, so mechanistic, so elemental in their movements and needs, and later on you will find them seated or standing with their little charcoal buckets or braziers to warm their hands and feet, in those gusty, icy streets of the East Side in winter, or coatless and almost shirtless in hot weather, open-mouthed for want of air. And they are New York too. Bucharest and Lemberg and Odessa come to the Bowery, and adding rich, dark, colorful threads to the rug or tapestry which is New York. Since these are but a portion, think of those other masses that come from the surrounding territory, north, south, east, and west. The ferries, have you ever observed them in the morning? Or the bridges, railway terminals, and every elevated and subway exit? Already at 6 and 6:30 in the morning, they have begun to trickle small streams of human beings, Manhattan or cityward, and by 7 and 7:15, these streams have become sizable affairs. By 7:30 and 8, they have changed into heavy, turbulent rivers, and by 8:15 and 8:30 and 9, they are raging torrents no less. They overflow all the streets and avenues and every available means of conveyance. They are pouring into all available doorways, shops, factories, and office buildings, those huge affairs towering so significantly above them. Here they stay all day long, causing those great hives and their adjacent streets to flush with a softness of color not indigenous to them. And then at night, between 5 and 6, they are going again, pouring forth over the bridges and through the subways and across the ferries and out on the trains until the last drop of them appears to have been exuded, and they are pocketed in some outlying side street or village or metropolitan hall room, and the great turbulent night of the city is on once more. And yet they continue to stream cityward, this cityward. From all parts of the world they are pouring into New York, Greeks from Athens and the realms of Sparta and Macedonia, living 6, 7, 8, 10, 12 in one room, sleeping on the floors and dressing and eating and entertaining themselves God knows how. Jews from Russia, Poland, Hungary, and the Balkans, crowding the East Side and the inlying sections of Brooklyn, and huddling together in thick, gummy streets, singing in street crowds around ballad-mongers of the woes of their native land, seeking with a kind of divine poetic flair a modicum of material comfort which their previous condition for at least 1,500 years has scarcely warranted. Italians from Sicily and the warmer vales of the south, crowding into great sections of their own, all hungry for a taste of New York. Germans, Hungarians, French, Polish, Swedish, Armenians, all with sections of their own, and all alive to the joys of the city, and how eager to live, great gold and scarlet streets throbbing with the thoughts of them. And last but not least, the illusioned American from the Middle West and the South and the Northwest and the Far West, crowding in and eyeing it all so eagerly, so yearningly like the others. Ah, the little shabby blue-light The moral hungry homes, how full they are of them, and how hopeless. How the city sings and sings for them, and in spite of them, flaunting ever afresh its lures and beauties, a city as wonderful and fateful and ironic as life itself. The waterfront. Were I asked to choose a subject which would most gratify my own fancy, I believe I would choose the docks and piers of New York. Nowhere may you find a more pleasingly encouraging picture life going on at a leisurely gait, but going, nor one withal set in a lovelier framework. And personally, I have always foolishly imagined that the laborers and men of affairs connected with them must be the happier for that connection. It is more than probable that that is not true, but what can be more interesting than long, heavily laden piers jutting out into the ever-flowing waters of a river, and those tall masts adjoining, how they rock and swing. Whistler had a fancy for scenes like these. They appealed to his sense of line and background and romance. You can look at his etchings of collections of boats along the Thames at London and see how keenly he must have felt the beauty of what he saw. Networks of ropes and spars, stout, stodgy figures of half-idle laborers, delicious, comforting, homey suggestions of houses and spires behind, and then the water. How the water sips and gurgles about these stanchions and spiles and hulls. You stand on the shore or on the hard-cobbled streets of the waterfront, crowded with trucks and cars, and you realize that the too solid substance of which they are composed is to be here for years. But this water at your feet, this dark, silent current sipping about the boats and rocking them, the big boats and the little boats, is running away. Here comes a chip. There goes a wisp of straw. A tomato box comes leisurely bobbing upon the surface of the stream, and now a tug heaves into view, puffing and blowing, and then a great liner being towed to her dock, and then these nearer boats fastened here, how they rest and swing in the summer sunshine. No rush, no hurry, only slow movement. Yet all are surely and gradually slipping away. In an hour your ship will be a mile or two farther downstream. In a day or 2 or 3, your liner will be once more upon the bosom of the broad Atlantic, or later even the Pacific. The tug you saw towing it will be pulling at something else, or you will find it shoving its queer stubby nose into some quaint angle of the waterside, hardly earning its skipper's salt. Is it not a delicious, lovely, romantic picture, and yet with the tang of change and decay in it too? As for the vast piers on the shores of the Hudson, the East River, the Jersey side, and Brooklyn and Staten Island, where the liners house themselves, I cannot fancy anything more colorful. They come from all ports of the world, these big ships. They bring tremendous cargoes, not only of people but of goods. and they carry large forces of men, to say nothing of those who assist them to load and unload. If you watch any of the waterfronts to and from which they make their entry and departure, you will find that you can easily tell when they are loading and unloading. The broad, expansive street fronts before these piers are crowded with idling men waiting for the opportunity to work, the call of duty or of necessity. And it is an interesting crowd of men always, imposingly large on occasion. Individually, these men are crude but appealing, the kind of man that is usually and truly dubbed a working man. They have in the main rough, quaint ambling figures, and rougher, ruder hands and faces. Some of them are black from having shoveled in the holds of vessels, or passed coal. Coal passers is their official title. And some are dusky and strawy from having juggled boxes and bales. But they are men who, with a small capacity for mental analysis, are taking things exactly as they find them. They are not even possessed of a trade, unless you would call the art of piling boxes and bales under the direction of a foreman a trade. Apparently, they have no sense of the sociologic or economic arrangement of life, no comprehension of the position which they occupy in the affairs of the world. They know they are laborers, and as such subject to every whim and fancy of their masters. They stand or sit like sheep in droves, awaiting the call of opportunity. You see them in sun or rain, on hot days and cold ones, waiting here. Sometimes they jest, sometimes they talk, sometimes they sit and wait. But the water with which they are so intimately connected, from which they draw their subsistence, flows on. I have seen a vain, self-conscious foreman come out from one of these great pier buildings, and with a Caesar-like wave of his hand beckon to this man and that. At his sign, a score of men would rise and look inquiringly in his direction, dumb and patient like cattle. And then he would pick this one and that, wavering subtly over his choice, pushing aside this one who was not quite strong enough perhaps, or agile enough, laying a hand favoringly on that, and then turning eventually and leaving the remaining members of the group dumb but a little disappointed. Invariably they seem to me to be a bit bereaved and neglected, sorry that they could not help themselves, but still willing to wait. I have sometimes thought that cattle are better provided for, or at least as well. But from an artistic and natural point of view, the scene has always fascinated me. Is it morning? The sun sparkles on the waters. The wind blows free. Gulls wheel and turn and squeal, white flecks above the water. Swarms of vehicles gather with their loads. Life seems to move at a smart clip. Is it noon? A large group of men is to be seen idling in the sun, blue-jacketed, swarthy-faced, colorful against the dark background of the piers. Is it night? The lanterns swing and rock. There is darkness overhead and the stars. I sometimes think no human being ever lived who caught more significantly, more sweetly, the beauty of the waterfront than the great Englishman Turner. When one looks at his canvases, rich in their gold of sunshine, their blue of sky, their haze of moisture, one feels all that the sea really presents. This man understood, as did Whistler, only he translated his mood in regard to it all into richer colors, those gorgeous golds, reds, pinks, greens, blues, and he had a greater tenderness for atmosphere than did Whistler. In Whistler, one misses more than the bare facts, albeit deliciously, artistically, perfectly presented. In Turner, one finds the facts presented as by nature in her balmiest mood, and idealized by the love and affection of the artist. You have seen The Fighting Temeraire, of course. It is here in New York Harbor any sunny afternoon. The wind dies down. The sun pours in a golden flood upon the east bank from the west. The tall elevator stacks and towering chimneys of factories on the west shore give a beauty of line which no artist could resist. Up the splashing bosom of the river, trembling silver and gold in the evening light, comes a great vessel. Her sides stand out blackly, her masts and funnels, tinged with an evening glow of gold, burn and shimmer against a magnificent, a radiant sky, where red and gold clouds hang in broken patches. She floats, exquisitely penciled and colored, the Fighting Temeraire. You would know her, only it is now the Hudson and not the Thames. The skyline, the ship masts, the sun, the water, all these are alike. The very ship is the same, apparently, and the sun drops down as it did that other day when his picture was painted. The stars come out, the masts rock, swinging their little lamps. The water runs sipping and sucking at the docks and piers. The winds blow cool, and there is silence until the morning. Then the waterfront assumes its quaint, delicious, easy atmosphere once more. It is once more fresh and free. So runs its tide, so runs its life, so runs our very world away. And with that beautiful image, I think we'll end this evening's reading of selections from The Colors of a Great City by Theodore Dreiser. I confess I wasn't a huge fan of Dreiser when I studied him in college, but this book is making me think a little differently about him. I may have to give him another go. If you'd like to read this work for yourself and see the illustrations, as always, you'll find a link to a free ebook from Project Gutenberg in the show description. The description also includes links to ways you can support this podcast and keep it ad-free, including subscribing to our Patreon, where you'll get exclusive episodes heard nowhere else, or by dropping us a one-time tip via buymeacoffee.com, no subscription required. I hope you'll take a moment to check them out. Thank you so much for joining me for this evening's reading. Until our next boring book, good night.